Hola clase, hoy vamos a discutir la influencia de comida mexicano en los Estados Unidos. So today we are going to be talking about the influence of Mexican food in the United States. So hopefully you are not too hungry because we're going to be talking about some pretty delicious dishes. Y por supuesto, vamos a comenzar con los tacos. So, of course, we're going to talk about tacos just so I can pique your interest. I thought this was a really interesting fact that I came across the other day. According to nationaltacoday.com, Americans are eating billions of tacos every year, 4.5 billion to be more specific. That is a lot of tacos. I always like to share the story about when I was growing up as a teenager in the 90s. There was not as much Mexican food as there is now on our dinner tables. And so if you went to any kind of party or for example, if we were celebrating the Bills in the Super Bowl, in the 90s, nobody was bringing guacamole, salsa, and tortilla. It just hadn't expanded that far yet. So you can imagine how much the Mexican food has grown in the last 25 years alone. And a huge part of that, regardless if you like this fact or not, is because of Taco Bell. And so personally, I am not a huge fan of Taco Bell, but that's my opinion. And I definitely don't shame what people like to eat. But I also thought this fact was quite astounding. Americans not only love tacos, but they also love their Taco Bell. Around half of the U.S. population visits a Taco Bell once every 11 days. And so that is pretty astounding to me. But there is a positive to this. And so I'm going to tell you the history of Taco Bell right now to try to wrap our brains around this fact. The chain actually started in 1954 as a burger stand owned by Glenn Bell. And you can see a picture of our Glenn Bell right there, Glenn William Bell. And on the left-hand side, he originally owned a burger joint called Bell's Burgers in San Bernardino, California. And he was located very close to the McDonald's brothers, and his business wasn't doing as well as he would like to because the McDonald's brothers were taking all of that business. And his burger joint happened to be across the street from Meat La Cafe. And every day he would notice a very long line out the door for lunch. He realized that people were eating these tacos. And so eventually he wanted to see what this was all about. So he started visiting the restaurant every day and ordering tacos. And he caught on to this. So he was going every day in hopes of trying to figure out what this recipe was. And so the owner of Meat La Cafe finally came out one day and said, if you are going to rip me off, do it right. Here's the recipe. I will give it to you and you can do what you want with it. And so Glenn Bell took this taco recipe and started to sell tacos and burgers, which was a huge success. He had a restaurant called Tio Tacos, I believe, and it did pretty well. So eventually he was able to open up the first Taco Bell. And so this is one of the originals that you can see here. And since then, the chain has more than 7,000 locations and over 350 franchises worldwide. Its commitment to branding and its changing product lineup have made it one of the most accessible and unique fast food restaurant chains around. So regardless of how you feel about Taco Bell, it is at the very least a gateway for people to try Mexican food and maybe then seek out more authentic Mexican food. And so what I also would like to reiterate, I'm going to show you this clip in a little second, that Meat La Cafe, the owners, they're now in their 4th generation. And so people have asked them, do you feel bitter that this man came, took this recipe and made billions? And they absolutely do not. They have everything what they had hoped and dreamed for, which was a successful business. They've expanded to be able to hold quinceañeras. They're very, very involved in their community, so much so that they had a huge play in Cesar Chavez and a couple of other different important roles in the community. And so I always like to reiterate this point. Yes, Glenn Bell took this recipe and made billions off of it, but also the Meat La Cafe owners are happy. They're in their 4th generation. They didn't want more than what they had in front of them, and that's what makes them happy. And Glenn Bell made his millions, and that makes him happy. And so what I'm trying to say is that there is enough for everybody in this world, and that's the philosophy kind of Meet La Cafe is taking, and that's a very rare viewpoint, I think, and I think it's really powerful. So what I'm going to show you right now is just a short video on Meet La Cafe, because it exists today. You can still go get tacos there, and give you a little bit of a history about Meet La Cafe.
It's a small Mexican restaurant in a small California city, but Lily Luciano tells us its legacy can be found across the country and around the world. Along Old Route 66 in San Bernardino, California, sits one extraordinary family kitchen.
I remember it almost as an extension of my grandmother's kitchen in my grandmother's house.
This is it right here. This is exactly how it's been done here since 1937.
Mike Montaño is the co-owner of Meet La Cafe, opened by his grandmother, Lucia Rodriguez, in 1937.
It's where I would see her most frequently. It was where I saw family most frequently. And to me, it was not a restaurant. It was not a business. It was just part of what made my family who they were.
After immigrating from her native Mexico in 1928, Rodriguez opened Meet La Cafe to quite literally feed her family and her growing neighborhood.
It was like during the Depression, so she knew what it was like to be hungry. And she told my mother the reason that she was opening up the restaurant is because she didn't want any of her family members to go hungry.
Patio Campbell is also one of her grandkids and the general manager.
What is this place like now? Who comes in here? It's like generational customers, sons and daughters of people that used to come here.
We come like every other Sunday. We come down after we get out of church.
What's the tradition with having anyone on Sundays? Hangover?
Enter through these old doors, and the lines that divide us disappear almost as fast as the famous chile relleno on a hot plate.
State senators, congressmen, everyone comes here.
A place to be seen.
It's a place.
And Montaño says one particular customer in the 1950s got more than just the tacos to go.
The legend as I know it, across the street was a burger stand called Bell's Burgers. And the owner, Glenn Bell, saw that my grandparents had a line to purchase tacos. At the time, I think they were 25 cents each. He wanted to understand this food item, why people liked it so much and why it was so popular. And my grandparents kind of understood what he was doing, and they wanted to help him.
And so Glenn Bell, armed with Doña Lucia's beloved hard-shell taco recipe, launched Taco Bell.
What does the family say about that?
Everybody's been fairly philosophical. I don't want people to feel like they weren't successful or that they were taken advantage of or anything like that.
The generosity rippled beyond the treasures of the kitchen. Through the years, Meet La served as a gathering spot for community organizing, even earning its place in the history of the fight for civil rights.
One of the most important stories that I know about was the meeting of different community organizations that helped to desegregate public businesses in San Bernardino. There were days of the week that Mexican kids of Mexican descent could not swim in the open.
Those meetings led to a court case and decision which desegregated all California parks and pools, a precursor for Brown versus Board of Ed.
That was the importance that they placed on this restaurant, was that it was not just a place to serve food, but it was a place for people to meet, to talk, to share ideas, and to move our community forward.
What's going on here?
This is our ranchero chili verde sauce that we make here.
Despite Vila's reputation for generosity, there is one thing they won't share.
And this is the secret one that goes on the tacos or any of our other dishes.
The recipe for their taco sauce.
Our most secret recipe, there are 3 people right now who can make it, including myself. And we try not to write any part of it.
For everything else, the door stays open. The tortillas are served fresh, and the welcome warm as ever.
It's always been about having the same spirit that my grandmother instilled in this place in 1937. Come to my home, share a meal, we'll see you next time.
So I really enjoyed the message about Meet La Cafe and being a part of their community and help moving their community forward. So I hope this enlightens you a little bit about the history of Taco Bell and tacos, and also that there's all sorts of authentic Mexican food. When the grandma originally moved to California from Mexico, people will say, oh, well, the hardtail taco with the iceberg lettuce and the cheddar cheese isn't authentic to Mexico, but it was authentic to the grandmother who was cooking with what she had at that time, which was right after the Depression, and using what she had in that area. And so defining what authentic Mexican food is very difficult, and it's very fluid. And so it depends on who you talk to, and there's multiple versions of this. Okay, so when did the influence of Mexican food really start hitting the United States? We're going to talk about this with the chili queens, who eventually obviously introduced chili to us. And so we're talking about in the border down here by Texas, San Antonio. And originally, why is this? Why do we have such a huge influence of Mexican food in the United States? With me just off the top of your head thinking, how many cities in the United States can you name that have Spanish influence? So, for example, the Spaniards came over to conquer the Aztecs, and also at the same time had established all of these different cities within the United States, because it was still Mexico, such as Los Angeles. So with that being said, how many other cities can you think of that have a name with a Spanish origin? Right? These are just a handful. There are hundreds. Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, San Jose, Santa Clara, Palo Alto, El Fresno, Boca Raton, Buena Vista, San Pedro, and so on. And the reason for this is because here is the borders for Mexico now, La Frontera, and this is what Mexico used to look like before. And so the border changed after the American-Mexican War, the Mexican-American War. And that is what we call it in the United States. And as you can see, due to this war, Mexico lost almost half of its territory, went all the way up to Montana. And like I had said, this is why we have so many Spanish cities in the United States, because the Spaniards had already started to settle here. So you have San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, Fresno, so on, so on, so on. So that's why we have such an influence, is that at one part, the majority of the United States was Mexico. And so that has influenced us highly. And also, just to put in this fact here, so we call it the Mexican-American War, and Mexico calls it the American invasion. So very two different words to describe something that happened. And also the reason they called it the American invasion is because the war was started for manifest destination, for greed only, and Mexico lost half of its property during this war. And so one of the things I love about foreign languages and understanding different viewpoints is that you do get a different perspective. And this is a perfect example of that, the American invasion versus the Mexican-American War. It gives a very different viewpoint. So with that being said, ¿cuántos hispanos hablantes hay en los Estados Unidos? How many Spanish speakers are there in the United States? 41 millones. So there's 41 million Spanish speakers in the United States, and not necessarily all of them come from Mexico, but a large influence is Mexican. And just to reiterate this point, we have the second highest population out of all Spanish-speaking countries. We rank number 2. The only population that is higher is Mexico. And we're not even an official Spanish-speaking country. So, la influencia comenzó 1870. 1870. So in 1870 is when we have the first recordings of the influence of Mexican food. So we're going to start with Chile. So originally it was called Chile con carne, but in order to sell it to the American people, you would have to lose the Mexican ethnicity and get rid of the con carne and change the chili to an I. So if you were not aware, chile is actually a Mexican food. And one of the reasons we have to thank for that is because of the chili queens of San Antonio. And the chili queens of San Antonio started out as a group of 11 women that would come out into the Plaza de Armas. Here we have the Alamo, and in the back was called La Plaza de Armas. And there was 11 tables, and they would set up their chili pots. They would evoke customers with good conversations, with music, in hopes that they would come over and try their chili with conversation and so on. And so they would compete against each other, and they would move from plaza to plaza depending on what events were happening. And they became pretty famous, and even tourists from all over would come to see them. This was something that was written in the San Antonio Daily Express in 1894. The ever attentive, always jolly chili queen. They are good fellows, these chili queens, and they are able and willing to talk on any subject that may be named from love to law. As a general rule, they are bright, bewitching creatures and put themselves too much trouble to please their too often rowdy customers. Every class of people who come to the city visit the places and partake of their piquant edibles. And so tourists would come. And that's what was so fascinating about the chili queens, is that food is the great equalizer. It attracted the wealthiest people, it attracted the poorest people, and here they all were in the same plaza socializing over food. And so obviously having really good entertainment and being having a better setup would attract more customers. And so that's what it was all about. And this went on for quite a few decades. And then eventually the chili queens headed on up to the Chicago World Fair in 1893. So remember, way before there was internet, this is how you found out what the latest, greatest things that were going around in the world. So we had these huge world fairs. And so the chili queen went up there. And of course it was a huge hit. And it just coincided with a huge movement going on in Chicago, the industrialization period where we could can everything. And guess what is really easy to can? That's right, chile. And so, like I said, they dropped the con carne off. They changed the E to an I to make it more appealing to the American people. And chili sold like crazy. And so that was one of the first Mexican foods that slowly spread across the United States. So, Ignacio Anaya is my next person that I'll be talking about. So many women in Texas that were military wives would often cross the border over to Mexico in search of new recipes to bring back to their hometowns. And one day they were visiting the restaurant of Ignacio Anaya, and the women were feeling a little bit hungry and wanted a snack. He didn't have anything to feed them, and he had these tortilla shells that had broke. He decided to fry them, throw some cheese on them, throw a jalapeno, and serve them. The women devoured them. They said, Ignacio, what are these called? And he said, there's no name for them. I just made this up now. And for any of you that know, Nacho is the nickname for Ignacio, hence why we have nachos. And the women brought this recipe back to Texas, and you've seen how nachos have transformed into so many different forms. Again, authentic Mexican food is fluid, and so this is what originally the nacho would have looked like, and you can see that it really turned into so many different things. And so that's how nachos have come to be. And the last story I'm going to talk today about is Doritos. So if you never thought about it, Dorito is a very Spanish sounding name. And one of the reasons we have Doritos is because in 1955, not long after Disneyland opened in Anaheim, California, the Frito-Lay snack company opened Casa de Fritos, a Mexican-style restaurant in Disneyland's Frontierland. Casa de Fritos got its tortillas from Alex Foods, a local tortilla factory. And one day, someone from Alex Foods came in that was delivering the tortillas and saw these two teenagers. They had broken a whole bunch of tortilla shells and they were just throwing them out. And the man suggested that maybe they don't waste those. They fry them and throw some cheese spice on them and put them out to the table to see if people will eat them as appetizers. And of course, people loved this. And so then the owner of Frito-Lay came in and said, what are you doing? Why are you, selling these for free, putting these out for free? Asked for the recipe, took it back to Frito-Lay and turned it into Doritos. So here again, we have a really interesting story about how recipes came to be and also who took credit for them. And so with that being said, here we have born Doritos. And this is actually what the original bag looked like. And it said tortilla chips on it. It does not say that now. And now it has become one of America's favorite foods. And that was in 1993 when it became number one. But before that, it was popular, but not nationally popular. And so in order to make it more popular, they lost its ethnic Mexican character. So as you can see, they dropped the sombrero off of it. They took the tortilla shell, made it look less Mexican. And after they did it, it was easier to sell this to the American people, who then gobbled it up. So it's just really interesting too how Americans as a culture, and I would never categorize one person as our entire nation, that we will eat your food, but then that's where it stops. We have no problem taking these things and making our own and also devouring them, but then we're also so afraid of allowing more culture into our lives when it comes to humans. And so I find this part to be really fascinating about how we function as Americans. So this was just a small story today about the influence of Mexican food, and I am sure that it has influenced your life in one way or another. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the discussion. Y hablamos pronto. Que tenga buen día. Chao.